The morning everything finally cracked open began in a way so ordinary it almost felt cruel, with the faint buzz of my phone alarm vibrating against the wooden nightstand, the distant sound of early traffic drifting through the thin bedroom window, and the smell of coffee brewing automatically in the kitchen, the way it had every weekday for more than 2 decades. Because routine was the backbone of my life, and the one thing I believed held everything together. My name is Aaron Luckraja. I am 52 years old, and for nearly 19 years I have worked as a senior aircraft systems technician at a regional aviation maintenance hub outside the city of Stunhaven, a job that requires calm focus, discipline, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Because when you are responsible for machines that carry hundreds of lives through the sky, mistakes are not just costly, they are fatal. That sense of responsibility shaped the man I became at home too, the husband who paid bills early, fixed broken cabinets, stayed up late when my wife couldn't sleep, and believed loyalty was something you practiced daily rather than promised once. I thought that kind of steadiness was enough to protect a marriage, until the woman I had shared my life with for 24 years stood in the kitchen that morning holding two swimsuits like evidence in a courtroom, one modest and brightly colored, the other so small it barely deserved to be called clothing, and asked me which one made her look more alive, as if her reflection alone could tell her who she had become or who she wanted to be again. Her hair was styled carefully, her makeup flawless, and her expression carried that strange spark I had seen growing in her over the last several months, the same spark that lit up every time her phone buzzed with messages she tried too hard to hide, the same spark that had made her start buying new clothes, wearing unfamiliar perfume, and talking endlessly about how she needed to rediscover herself before it was too late. I already knew who this was for, even before she said his name, because I had watched that name flash on her screen enough times to feel it carve itself into my chest like a quiet betrayal. And when I finally told her that if she left town with him, if she crossed that line, I would walk away from our marriage for good, she laughed like I was telling a harmless joke, dismissed me as predictable and harmless, and turned away without understanding that I was already standing at the edge of something irreversible. For a long time after the door closed behind her and the sound of her suitcase wheels faded down the driveway, I stood frozen in the living room, staring at the space where she had just been, feeling like the air itself had been pulled out of my lungs. Because in that moment, I finally understood something that had taken me years to see clearly, that my patience had not been seen as strength, but as permission, and my silence had been mistaken for weakness rather than restraint. I had spent decades believing that love meant absorbing discomfort, smoothing over conflict and sacrificing pieces of yourself so the other person could feel secure. But somewhere along the way, that belief had turned into a cage I built for myself, one that she walked out of without a second glance. Every object in the house felt heavier than before, as if the walls themselves were tired of holding secrets and unspoken resentments, and when I finally forced myself to move, I walked straight to the small workshop at the back of the garage, a place I usually went to clear my head, and opened a drawer that contained a single sealed envelope I had prepared months earlier, long before she ever booked that trip, back when her emotional distance first became impossible to ignore. Inside were legal documents, trust restructuring forms, property transfers, and carefully drafted agreements that I had quietly assembled with professional help, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, because I had learned in my career that the people who survive disasters are not the ones who react fastest, but the ones who prepare before anyone else believes there is danger. Holding that envelope, I realized that while she thought she was stepping into freedom, I was stepping into clarity, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not sadness, but resolve. 3 hours after her flight left the runway, I was sitting in the waiting area of a law firm tucked between two towering office buildings downtown, my hands resting on my knees, my heartbeat steady, the envelope placed carefully beside me like a contract with my own future. I had chosen this firm because of its reputation for precision and discretion. Because when you are dismantling something that has defined your life, you need people who understand that emotions cannot override legality, no matter how loud they become. The attorney who met with me had sharp eyes and a voice that carried the calm authority of someone who had seen countless lives fall apart across his desk. And as he reviewed each document, he nodded slowly, confirming what I already knew, that once these papers were filed, my wife would return from her trip to a home she no longer owned, a life she could not reclaim, and a reality that would not bend to her outrage. The trust she had signed years earlier during routine estate planning, without reading the fine print because she trusted me, contained a clause that would activate the moment she abandoned the marital residence, and everything I had prepared was not only legal but final. When I left his office, my phone buzzed with a message from my niece Paul, who had agreed to help me coordinate the next phase. A young woman whose loyalty and sharp instincts reminded me that not all relationships are built on convenience. And in that moment, I felt more supported than I had in years. While she flooded social media with carefully posed photos meant to show how happy and free she was, I studied each image with the same methodical focus I used when inspecting aircraft systems, looking past the surface to the details most people overlooked, and it did not take long for the cracks in her story to reveal themselves. A reflection in her sunglasses showed more than two people at the table, a luxury wine bottle far beyond what her supposed travel companion could afford, and a hotel logo that did not match the budget-friendly resort she claimed they were staying at. And piece by piece, it became clear that there was someone else involved, someone with far more money, someone who wanted to remain invisible. That realization did not break me the way I thought it might, because by then, I had already accepted that the woman I married was gone, replaced by someone chasing validation and escape at any cost, and the only thing left for me to do was finish what I had started. The night before her return, a woman named Marable arrived at the house with a single suitcase and a quiet strength shaped by loss. A former corporate consultant rebuilding her life after tragedy, recommended by my niece as someone who needed stability just as much as I needed distance. She signed the lease, accepted the keys, and stepped into the master bedroom with a calm confidence that came from knowing who she was. And when she asked why I was helping her, I told her the truth, that she was not the one who betrayed me, and that every person deserves a place where they are truly wanted. By the time my wife's flight landed, everything was sealed and I returned to work, focusing on machines while my phone vibrated with messages I ignored, because for once I was choosing peace over chaos. The moment she realized she was locked out unfolded exactly as I had anticipated, her confusion quickly turning into fury as she demanded entry to a place she no longer had any legal claim to. And when Marable calmly informed her that she was a tenant, not a trespasser, the illusion of control shattered instantly. Her calls to me grew more frantic, but I explained that the documents she had once dismissed now defined her reality, and every attempt she made to threaten legal action collapsed under the weight of her own signatures. As the days passed, her carefully curated image crumbled publicly, friends and family questioning her version of events, while I found unexpected peace in the quiet routines I shared with Marable, discovering that comfort does not need drama to feel alive. When my wife appeared in person demanding restoration, I told her gently that she had already left long before she boarded that plane, and there was nothing left to reclaim. The final revelation came when investigators uncovered that her secret benefactor was under federal scrutiny, and records showed she had accepted payments she could not justify, placing herself in serious legal danger. I cooperated fully, determined to protect myself from a collapse I had no part in creating, and when arrests were made, her name surfaced, confirming everything I feared. Months later, the house felt alive again, filled with warmth and intention, and Marable planted flowers where neglect once thrived, reminding me that growth is possible even after devastation. When news arrived that my wife had accepted a plea deal, I felt relief instead of bitterness, understanding that some endings are not meant to be mourned, only learned from. As the sun set beyond the skyline and planes traced glowing paths across the sky, I realized that strength is not found in endurance alone, but in knowing when to let go and rebuild, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. The week following the legal filings felt unreal, like walking through a dream where time moved too slowly yet too fast, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. From the clicking of my work boots against the hangar floor to the echo of hydraulic tools whining above my head, as I inspected aircraft systems that suddenly felt simpler than the chaos unfolding in my personal life. My phone stayed in my pocket, vibrating with messages I refused to read, because every unanswered call from Selene felt like proof that the world she believed was permanent had finally shifted beneath her feet. And instead of panic, I felt a strange calm, the kind that comes when a long-delayed storm finally passes. At night, when I returned to my small apartment only a few blocks away from the house I once called home, I sat in silence, replaying memories not with sadness, but with the clarity of someone who finally sees a pattern for what it truly was, realizing that I had spent decades trying to preserve something that was already eroding, and that the hardest part was not losing her, but admitting I had lost myself long before she ever walked away. When Selene finally appeared again, not through a screen or a voice message, but standing in the driveway across from the house she no longer owned, her presence felt foreign, like a ghost wandering into a place that no longer recognized her. She stayed in her car for nearly an hour, watching the lights through the windows, perhaps expecting guilt or nostalgia to pull me back, but all I felt was distance, a separation deeper than any legal document could define. Marable and I had settled into a quiet rhythm, one built on respect rather than expectation, on conversations instead of accusations. And when Selene finally gathered the courage to knock on the door days later, demanding to be let in, the look in her eyes told me she still believed I would rescue her from the consequences of her own choices, unaware that the version of me who would have done that no longer existed. Her attempts to reclaim control became louder and more desperate as the truth of her situation sank in, moving from legal threats to emotional pleas, from anger to tears, and finally to a hollow kind of bargaining that revealed how deeply she had underestimated the weight of her own actions. She accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of destroying everything we had built, never acknowledging that she had been dismantling our marriage piece by piece for months. And when she asked how I could replace her so quickly, I told her quietly that I had not replaced her. I had simply stopped waiting for someone who had already left. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the realization that some conversations come too late to change anything. The investigation into her secret benefactor unfolded rapidly, each new detail more disturbing than the last, revealing a web of financial misconduct that placed her at the center of something far more dangerous than a broken marriage. Bank records showed deposits she could not explain, luxury purchases that had never passed through our shared accounts, and connections to people whose names appeared in news headlines rather than social gatherings. And as federal agents began piecing together their case, it became clear that her pursuit of freedom had led her into a world where loyalty was transactional and consequences were inevitable. When I was contacted by authorities, I cooperated fully, not out of spite, but out of a need to separate my life from a storm I had not created, understanding that silence would only pull me deeper into something I wanted no part of. The day she was arrested, the weight of the past finally lifted, not because I felt victorious, but because the uncertainty was gone, replaced by a truth that could no longer be denied or rewritten. She called me from a detention facility, her voice small and fractured, asking for help, for money, for a lawyer. And when I told her I could not be the one to save her, she cried in a way I had never heard before, a sound stripped of anger and pride, leaving only fear behind. Ending that call felt like closing a door that had been open far too long, and though it hurt, it also marked the moment I truly chose myself. Months passed, and life slowly reshaped itself into something steady and real, built on routines that no longer felt empty, but intentional, from shared meals with Marab to quiet mornings filled with sunlight and coffee, to evenings spent talking about hopes instead of regrets. The house, once heavy with unresolved tension, felt alive again, every room reflecting a sense of peace I had forgotten was possible. And when Marab planted flowers in the garden that Selene had abandoned, it felt like a symbol of renewal, proof that beauty could grow in places left neglected for too long. The legal process continued in the background, but it no longer defined my days, as I focused instead on building a future that felt authentic, one rooted in honesty and mutual respect rather than fear of loss. When I learned that Selene had accepted a plea deal and would face years of consequences for her involvement, I felt neither joy nor anger, only closure, understanding that some lessons are learned too late, and some bridges cannot be rebuilt once they have burned. One evening, as the sky faded into deep shades of orange and purple and aircraft lights traced glowing paths overhead, Marab and I sat together on the porch, watching the world move forward, and for the first time in years I felt truly present, no longer haunted by what was lost, but grateful for what had been found. The quiet was no longer lonely but comforting, filled with the promise of something new, something real. Looking back, I realized that love is not about holding on at any cost, but about knowing when to let go, when to walk away from what no longer serves you, and when to rebuild with someone who chooses you just as you choose them. Selene had chased an illusion of freedom, only to discover that escape without integrity leads nowhere, while I had learned that true strength lies in self-respect and the courage to begin again. And so, as another morning light filtered through the windows of a home that finally felt like mine, I understood that my story was no longer about betrayal or loss, but about growth, resilience, and the quiet power of choosing a life built on truth, knowing that even after the deepest fractures, something whole can still emerge.